Hi, everybody. Welcome to our Introduction to Fashion Supply Chains workshop. We are very excited. This is one of our first times doing an intro-level program like this. So we're very excited to have Heather and Lauren here to talk us through fashion supply chains and what they are, what the issues are, and then how we could make change in the industry. So before we get started, I want to share a little bit more about Remake. I know we put this out on social, not everybody is ambassador. So Remake unites changemakers in the fight for human rights and climate justice in the clothing industry. And just some fast facts if you didn't know. Today, 93% of fashion brands don't pay garment workers enough to live on. And of the 70 million highly skilled garment workforce, 80% are women of color who not only face low pay and wage theft, but who also disproportionately are impacted by floods and heat from climate change. So this is something that we'll be talking a lot about today, about where our clothing comes from, who is impacted by from the picking of the fiber to the garment making to distribution, how those people are affected, and then how we could make change, whether we're in those areas or not. And then also, I did want to share, I'll drop Remake's website in the chat as well. But if you're interested in our ambassador program or anything that we have coming up, we do events like this every single month. You can find them all on our website, and I will drop that in the chat. And then a little bit more about our speakers as well. So Heather is a British-based writer in Berlin. I will drop her bio in the chat if you're more of a reader. But she has 10 plus years working in the fashion industry, and her focus is on human rights and social justice in the supply chain. Her work has been featured in Vogue, Atmos, and the Remake Times. So she is very knowledgeable about fashion supply chains. I'll be dropping their articles in a minute. Heather and Lauren both have articles in the Remake Times, which is why we're doing this program today. And then over to Lauren. Lauren is a journalist, a sustainable fashion advocate, storyteller, and an activist who seeks progress over perfection largely through her sustainability blog and podcast, Sustainably LB. She's amazing. Her whole bio is in the chat. She also does swaps and is the co-founder of Swap Omaha. So we're so grateful that you guys can both be here today. And let's get started. So I talking about Remake and why we decided to do this program. One quote that really stuck with me that I just wanted to mention before I hand it on over to Heather is one of our Remake board members, professors and scientists, Dr. Hakan, who we'll see quotes from him throughout this presentation. But he says, fashion as a system is paralyzed by the imbalance of power relations. And that's something that really sticks with me as we were working through this program, and something that I hope that everyone will take away from what we talk about today. So right before I hand it over to Heather, I just want everybody to think real quick, how traveled are the clothes that you're wearing right now? And feel free to type in the chat if you know exactly where your clothes are coming from, or if you're not really sure. They come from a lot of different places, as we'll see in a minute. But yeah, please drop in the chat if it came from an area near you, or if you just bought it from the store and you're not really sure where it came from. And there is a lot to go into it, so it is kind of a heavy question. Marissa, vintage made in Canada, one made in the US for the other. Materials niche, very well traveled. Yes, well said, Marissa. Very traveled. Yeah, and as we'll see, that is the case for a lot of our clothing. So I will hand it on over to Heather to just talk about what a fashion supply chain is.
Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be here. I will just get on to the basics because we've got quite a lot to cover today. So as you may or may not already know, fashion supply chain is a far-reaching, intricate network of companies and businesses that are involved in creating an item of clothing and getting it to us consumers. it's how the whole industry operates. Basically, it's global, it involves millions of people worldwide, and it spans a whole range of stages and duties, from the farmers making or farmers growing crops to garment workers to store clerks, delivery drivers. It's huge. What I'll outline now is the traditional setup generally. And we're mostly talking about big brands. So we're also focusing on first-hand retail. Obviously, things get a lot more complicated when you start looking into second-hand clothing market and product lifestyle and options for disposal. And the steps don't also necessarily happen in this order. But step one, we have designing the garment. So in this stage, it's where the brand decides on the fabrics, the silhouettes, the trims, and the finishes. The volume of new clothing released per season can be monumental, particularly in fast fashion, where companies are now basing their product designs on trends and viral moments rather than whether something will stand the test of time. Once we have that, we move on to step two, where we source the material. So that could be the growing of raw textile material like cotton or silk or flax, which then has to be cleaned and spun. Or if we're talking about polyesters, then it's melting plastics. Lauren will talk about this more in a minute. And then your fabrics are like woven into their final structures and dyed and chemically finished. And these stages can all happen in different countries and factories. And it's also here that's considered the most like environmentally taxing stage, because it uses a load of chemicals, which is super damaging for local biodiversity and agriculture and water supplies and so forth. And then after that, stage three, the garment manufacturing. This phase involves the cutting and the sewing and the finishing of a garment ready for shipment to retailers. More often than not, this phase is conducted in garment producer countries in the global south, where brands in the global north are outsourcing production in search of cheap labor. The next slide will focus on what's wrong with the supply chain, and a lot of it is here. And then finally, we have distribution and retail. So once the clothes are ready, they're then shipped in bulk directly to the retailer or to storage facilities for direct consumer shipments. And this bit is also where brands love to talk about their offsetting and sustainability targets. But in order for any brand to be truly sustainable, A, don't make anything, but also they need to take the whole chain into account. So that's like a broad overview of what a supply chain looks like. For the next slide, what the issue is, this is huge. This could be a whole talk in itself. But firstly, transparency. Because the network we've talked about is so fragmented and the steps within every single stage can take place in different countries across the globe, it's incredibly hard to track. So for example, cotton grown in China could be woven and dyed in Cambodia, sewn in Indonesia and finished in Italy. And also, I mean, as we just found out with not really knowing where our clothing is from, the made in tag is added in the final stage, and therefore it's not representative of the product's journey at all most of the time. And as it stands, there's no legislation that forces brands to have a complete overview of their own supply chain. So companies can reap profits and remain shielded from supply chain injustice because they now have no legal obligation to account for actions that are carried out on their behalf. The setup is to be as efficient and fast as possible and create massive profit margins for brands and their parent companies. But what that means in reality is that garment workers in the global south, in clothing manufacturing countries like India, Pakistan, Cambodia, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and Indonesia, for example, they work long hours in high pressure environments, mostly women, in unsafe factory conditions to fulfill unfair and unrealistic production demand. Sorry, this is mega depressing. The pushing for lowest price possible while placing huge orders, setting impossible turnaround times, switching suppliers if another factory can do the same job for less. Brands are often making last minute changes to orders, which forces suppliers to eat the cost of work that's already been completed because they can't afford to lose the brand's business. And for additional context, generally brands don't pay for work until after delivery, which means that factories and suppliers must foot the bill in the meantime, which can take months. And to hit such wild targets, garment workers receive poverty wages. They often have to work overtime without overtime pay. They often fall victim to wage theft also, which is something we talk about a lot at Remake. And that occurs when fashion brands fail to pay for work that was already completed. The biggest recent example of that is when brands cancelled an estimated 40 billion, I think, worth of completed orders during the pandemic. We were all at home, we went shopping, they panicked, they cancelled the orders, but because the work had already been done, untold millions of workers were pushed into poverty. Additionally, sometimes work is also outsourced to secondary factories whose employees are experiencing the same conditions to complete the order, and that also makes the transparency issue we talked about before even more complicated. You then are also dealing with exploitative working conditions in addition to low pay or poverty wages. There's gender-based harassment and violence. There's huge tolls physically and mentally on their health. And factory conditions can be fatal, which we've learned time and time again. I'm sure everyone's heard of the Rana Plaza factory disaster in Bangladesh that collapsed and killed over 1,000 garment workers. And all of that before thinking of the consequences of the climate crisis, the role that fashion production plays in it, and the nations and the people in those nations that will suffer the consequences first. So yeah, that's the issue.
Thank you, Heather, for that run through. I'm going to hand it on over to Lauren now to go through a little bit deeper into the fashion supply chain from, sourcing materials at the beginning all the way to distribution at the end.
Hi, guys. I am super excited to be here. Thank you, Heather, for that. It is super informative and, yeah, a little bit depressing, but I think the insight into what actually happens is necessary. So I am not going to be very uplifting, but I am going to walk you through how everything is sourced. So we're going to start with like natural fibers. You have a couple silos for natural fibers. You have like your cotton and your hemp and your linen and stuff like that. That's more agriculture. I guess wool is animal products. So it's all agriculture. So you have your plants and you have your animals, and then you have your wool and cashmere and silk and angora and stuff like that. They're also natural fibers. So these fibers need to be harvested, and that involves a lot of workers on the front end too, which is tricky business because there aren't, at least in the United States, laws that protect these agricultural workers. There was just recently a law passed in Florida that bans any kind of legislation that would center these agriculture workers by giving them like mandatory breaks, water breaks, time in the shade, so there's a lot of elements that they're having to deal with that are detrimental to their health, besides the pesticides that they might be spraying on these crops. Plus, with animals and stuff like that, you don't really know if the animals are being treated ethically as well. So at the start, there is no visibility into how our fibers are even sourced. So Heather had mentioned earlier too about synthetic fibers, which are like your nylon, your polys, your elastane, all of those kinds of things that are fossil fuel based, and they shed microplastics. And synthetic fibers are being used more and more in the clothing that we are seeing produced, especially with the boom of fast fashion. And even if you do get a blend of, say, maybe it's 50-50, you could have 50% cotton, 50% elastane. When you get more blends into your fabrics, those are then harder to reuse at the end of the supply chain. So you want to keep them as one or the other as possible, right? But if you look at the tags on your garments, that's typically not the case. So you've got your fiber, natural or synthetic, and now you need to weave it into a yarn. So sorry, my kitten is like, oh, you're doing something? I want to be a part of it. Anyway, so most of the natural fibers Heather had mentioned, they need to be cleaned, and that is referred to as carded. So, I mean, like if you consider a lamb's wool, they're out in the field, they're having a great time, they probably get burrs and stuff like that. So all of that needs to be cleaned out of that material before it is turned into, what we know as a fiber to be woven into a fabric. So that's a very arduous task as well. Then, and Heather touched on this as well, you have to dye these fibers. And like we mentioned, and probably will continue to mention, none of this is linear. That's what makes the supply chain extra hard to trace as well, because none of it's linear and none of it is typically done in the same country. So the dyeing processes are the sneakiest for me when I learned about this, the sneakiest step in the whole supply chain, because like Heather mentioned, it takes the most energy, because synthetic fibers take hotter water to dye. So you are using more energy that way. And the dyes are often very caustic. So the people that are working with them they usually have zero protection around the dyes. And then the dyes are typically dumped into the nearest waterway with little to no protections for those waterways as well. And so when you look at it on that kind of scale, it is really mind blowing, because it seems like such a benign step in the process. You're like, oh yeah, the t-shirt's white. Getting something to be white is probably the hardest on the environment because of how many processes it has to go through. So sorry guys, this is a lot of information. We will move on to the part of, I guess you can read the article if you want to do like finishing and treatments and stuff like that. So we'll skip a little bit in the process, and now you have your garment, right? You have your garment. It has been touched by, at this point, at least at the bare minimum, a dozen hands before it even gets packaged to go into shipping. And what happens in the shipping process is, because our items they come from Bangladesh, they come from China, and they make their way to the West, they're often treated with like antifungals and stuff like that. So sometimes if you've ever gotten a package and you open it up and it smells like chemicals, it's because it is chemical laden, not only because of the dye, but because of the way it's been treated to actually, preserve it in the shipping, whether they're putting it on a plane or they're putting it on a boat to get it to you. So distribution is probably a little bit of the most straightforward. Like I said, it comes from the south to the north, and then it either goes to a shipping facility or straight to you. And then when you try it on, you would think that if you returned it, it would go back, like much like when we used to shop at stores, right? It would go back on the shelf if it was nice, unworn, whatever. For those of us that work retail, returns are easy peasy. It's nothing too hard to wrap your head around. Well, that doesn't happen with our online shopping returns. Our online returns get typically damaged out because they don't have the processes in place to restock, and they can just damage things out for insurance, and then those things go to landfill, to stuff like that. And if you're even thinking it from like a carbon cost, if you have something shipped from China to you to go back to China, you have that travel cost, whether it's by air or boat, and that is that's tough. And like Heather mentioned too, that's where the distros, where they try to offset their carbon emissions, which is another whole thing. So it kind of blows my mind that after all of this, after you source the materials, you spin them into fibers, you weave that fiber into a fabric, you dye it, you have the patterns, you cut the patterns, and finally it arrives to you. It doesn't fit, you return it, and then it just gets trashed. So yeah, and like I kind of mentioned earlier with the end of life piece, it's really hard to recycle materials that are a blend of a multiple things because we just don't have the infrastructure, and it's very expensive to come up with these kind of machines and processes to turn that end of life garment into a new garment. So, what needs to change? Uh, all of it, as you can tell from our speaking, all of it needs to change. But as Heather mentioned, the the brands don't own the factories. They, use them as contractors, which creates this really convenient loophole for them to not pay their garment workers or not pay for orders, or to just kind of wash their hands of the whole deal, is what a lot of brands with Rana Plaza did. They're like, oh, well, we don't, we're not in charge of that factory. That has nothing to do with us. They're just contractors. We rely on them to make good choices. Well, when they're squeezing every last dollar out of them, you're really putting everybody in a terrible position to make the right choices, right? So the brands really do have the dollars to update these factories, and they should be directly working with these factories to make these upgrades, not only for the individuals, for the environment, but honestly for the longevity of their brand, right? Don't you want something that's a tried and true thing? Like, don't you want to have partners that you can rely on and create a good product? All of this kind of, when I dive deep into issues like this, it blows my mind. I'm like, you want a supportive partner in these relationships, but I guess if you have a partner as an equal, you can't really exploit them in any capacity. So really that needs to change. The brands need to be held accountable for the factories and the supply chains where, it's a $3 trillion industry. There's definitely money to pour back into the infrastructure so that these processes and that these garments and garment workers are centered, and even the agriculture workers, every step of the supply chain is centered in giving people a livable wage, because as it stands right now, as you can tell, it's not.
Thank you, Lauren. Heather, I'm going to hand it back on over to you. I know something you talked about in your article is the really important parts of making these changes. What are some things that we could look for, some things that we can see to make sure that these changes are happening in the industry?
Yeah, I think Lauren just summed this up pretty well. Fashion has proved, the industry has proved so far that it's not going to change just based on goodwill. There needs to be, brands need to be held accountable, but also liable. Like, they need to know that this, like, things don't come for free, and they're the ones that are placing all of these horrific pressures on suppliers. So actionable steps would be the first part. Put in place every step of the supply chain that hold relevant parties liable for any injustice that's carried out. So that looks like fair contracts and codes of conducts for buyers and sellers, which are then not audited by the brands themselves, which happens sometimes. I think Nike maybe audits itself, which is the whole thing. So by independent parties that are non-biased, and then everything is enforced by legal contracts. That's the only way that we will get transparency. And not only that, then if these contracts are to ensure the well-being and the justice for garment workers, they have to be consulted and centered in the writing of legislation. If we're going to address this systemic power imbalance and top-down hierarchy, they need to be put at the center. These contracts need to ensure living wages and safe working environments, and include strategies for protection when unforeseen and unpredictable factors come into play, like factories having to shutter when a global pandemic happens, or if there's political turmoil in a country. I think a number of large groups like the H&M Group and Interdex, who like own so many brands, pulled out of Myanmar last year, I think, because the country is in massive political unrest. But the workers and the factories weren't given plenty of notice. So this needs to be centered in contracts too. And they need to make sure that those that are laid off, the people that are working for these brands, are taken care of. There are platforms in place so people aren't pushed into poverty or have to resort to sex work, for example, in order to feed their kids. Quite a few companies do have language mentioning responsible exit strategies in their codes of conduct, but language is not the same as a contract. I think at the end of the day, brands basically just need to realize that their workers are their biggest asset, and without their workers, they wouldn't exist. So as the quote by Dr. Hacken in this slide points out, it's radical collaboration and inclusion is what's going to drive action and change the industry for the better. And that's what we fight for and what we need to keep in our mind when we're looking at supporting campaigns and backing legislation that we believe in. And I think Alison's now going to talk us through the two accords.
Yeah, thank you both. And before we head out and open up to Q&A and talk about some like lighter things like what we're hopeful for, I wanted to highlight two things that, you know, we as Remake have been working on for a while with our labor partners. Something that's really important to us, as Heather mentioned, that is important just in the industry in general, is making sure that these are worker partners and these workers are having a seat at the table. So the Fabric Act is one thing. If you have been in the Remake community for a while, you might have seen that we went on an advocacy day last September. We had 80 people join us to DC. It was extremely powerful. But the Fabric Act is the Fashioning Accountability and Building Real Institutional Change Act. I'm going to drop the link in the chat if you want to read a little bit more about it. There's an amazing FAQ page on their website. Here we go. I'll drop it in there now. But just a little bit about it. So it is a US-based bill, and it's the establishment of a nationwide garment industry registry through the Department of Labor to promote transparency, hold bad actors accountable, and level the playing field. They also have new requirements to hold these fashion brands accountable and retailers along their manufacturing partners. You know, joint accountability is something that we don't see everywhere. It is extremely important. And then the last thing is setting an hourly pay in the garment industry. So not eliminating that per piece rate to make sure that people in the US are having livable wages, which, you know, not everywhere is doing that here. So the Fabric Act, please check it out, especially if you're based in the US. There's a lot of resources on the website that I dropped in the chat. If you are interested in, you know, seeing who's endorsing, there's people on the website. If you own a brand or work with a company or, you know, a union or a different labor group that would love to endorse, you could reach out to us. And then the next one I wanted to share is the International Accord. The International Accord is legally binding agreement between garment brands and trade unions to ensure worker health and safety in the textile and garment industry. And I know something that, you know, Heather and Lauren, you both mentioned is, you know, independent, and the brands not being the one to check in on their workers and to check in on their factories, to actually have, you know, people who are coming in from outside of the brands to making sure everything is safe for the workers. So workplace health and safety is really promoted through independent safety inspections, training programs, and complaints mechanisms for the workers. I will drop the International Accord website in the chat as well. And you can find both of these campaigns and others that Remake is working on our campaigns page. We have like a lot of ways that people could get involved past just like looking at the websites and reading the FAQs. We do have toolkits for a lot of these, different language if you're looking to talk about them in your communities, or if you want to, you know, call your senator or get endorsers for these pieces of legislation and these campaigns. So if you have any questions about these, we are always happy to talk about them. And I know that this was a very heavy topic today. There is a lot that we didn't get to cover, obviously, that goes into these supply chains. And unfortunately, it is, you know, very daunting to hear about, but it's hard to make change when you don't know the entire picture as a whole. So I guess to close us out before we go into Q&A, I wanted to ask both of you, Heather and Lauren, you know, what gives you hope in the midst of all these different things that we talked about that are really difficult? What gives you hope for the future?
I'll go first, I guess. So what gives me hope is that I know that I am not doing this alone. Through organizations like Remake. I can, sit here on a call and we can share this heavy thing that we all are very interested in, that, Heather and I are very passionate about, Allison's very passionate about. And it gives me a sense of like, I'm not doing the heavy lift alone. That's also something that my podcast helps me do too. I think sometimes I just do it so that I don't spiral, so I can talk to people that actually care as well. And then additionally, honestly, going out in nature gives me hope. It kind of reminds me what I'm fighting for, or even connecting with my local community. It recenters the narrative for me to get out of my own head and out of my own way, and to stop like doom spiraling, because when you look at the supply chain like we just did, it can look really, really daunting. So, recentering myself, I'm able to let that hope kind of bubble back up too, just listening to the birds, or honestly, like talking to a tree, or being out in my community and seeing, the faces of like my local vintage shop owner, and stuff like that really helps me to get out of my own way and recenter hope when these things are heavy.
Yeah, same answer. Yeah, I used to work at a men's street style publication, running the news team, and it was like working inside this hype vortex, basically, just like pushing out content drop after drop after drop, and it's just felt so just ill and alone, and just seeing how much stuff there is on the planet, and just thinking how doomed this industry is. But then through as much negativity as I saw in that, like the people behind the screens that I was connecting with were just all incredible and wanting change as well. So being part of a community, there's power in numbers, right? So I think there's the more that we work together, and the more that we join, and the more that we have these kind of discussions, the more hope there is. Yeah, I'm backing legislation.
I agree on all of the above. And just, talking about the community and how heavy these topics can be, something that gives me hope is community in general, whether that's locally and then also the remake community as well. These are very heavy topics to deal with alone, and it's very easy to, doom scroll and research these, and it's really spiral in all of the problems when the solutions feel really hard to obtain, especially when you're looking at policy and legislation that is a really long fight. So that really brings me back to RY is Remake and a lot of these other organizations where we are fighting for the workers. We're doing this for them, for the planet and the people on it. So I
Also
wanted
the
to
language with legislation as well, right? Like it can be so what's the word, like ostracizing and elitist, and it's kind of built like it's not for you, you won't understand this, and through community you also share knowledge that makes it all less
I
daunting.
completely agree. And that's why I'm so grateful that Lauren and Heather, you guys are both here to join us today to talk about this, because this is like the first step in moving forward. And I also wanted to share, I know I dropped it in the chat, I'll drop it again. We are having the Rust Belt Fiber Shed, which is based in the Midwest in the US, around 250-mile radius around Cleveland, Ohio. They're going to be joining us to talk about, their community and their fiber shed, soil to soil agriculture, and a lot of the different things that they are doing on a community level with farmers, people who are interested in fashion, designers, universities, stuff like that, to, make sure that we have hope in our communities and are supporting local, especially when it comes to fashion. So that'll be next week on the 25th. You could find the link there. It's free, it's virtual, just like this one. And I'm going to stop sharing now. And like I said, I know that we really went a lot into the fashion supply chain today. So I wanted to give a lot of time for questions. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to come off mute, type them in the chat. And also, Lauren, I saw Georgia Lee asked about your podcast, if you want to plug it in the chat as well. I'm also catching up in the chat as well to see if we have any questions. Trudy, a great comment. As a Sri Lankan, someone who has worked in the export apparel manufacturing industry, there before moving to the United States. Something I've witnessed in field doesn't get talked about as much as how samples get made before a brand finalizes a style and then proceeds into bulk production, and how these samples are discarded. In lots of ways happening, yeah, of course. Another question, what are your thoughts on trashy? I'm not sure what trashy is. So if anybody wants to clarify, or if anybody knows what that is and wants to answer that question, right ahead.
I do, and so trashy. It used to be 4 days, if anyone knows that, like FOR_days, and it was their take back bag. Now it is trashy, and I'm on the fence. I've used it once with my work through the clothing swaps, the monthly clothing swaps I do, because we do get some end of life clothing that can't be recirculated into the community. And like we mentioned earlier before, textile recycling is tricky at best. So it's nice to see that there is people, there's a system. It's the one of the only systems that is very forward about what they do. There are some, I don't know, when I look at their marketing, there are some hints of kind of greenwashy nature. You have to pay $20 for a take back bag, which is fine. I get it. Then you do get like $20 to purchase from their site, because they also make the clothing end on the 4 days, but they separated the trashy out, which also makes me wonder. It's like, okay, I understand it from a logical perspective of you want the upcycling to be one thing and the clothing to be the other. But the whole point of the first iteration of the take back bag was that one was supporting the other. So I honestly don't know. That's not answering the question at all. But it gives me a little bit of the ick, even though I have used it. So kind of use at your own discretion, I guess. It's better. Honestly, it's going to be better than throwing it in the trash. So there's that.
So what do you think? Like, I'm just like a regular human being, guys. I'm not even like deep into the textile industry or anything. Like, I actually come from the music industry, but I've been thinking about textiles like for so long. It's just because, fast fashion and, fashion all together and influencing and all of those things like are like tied together in a way on my side. And it's just like, even if you're like a consumer that it's like aware, like I have things that belong to my mother and I have things from my high school days. Like when you really need to let go something, it's really hard to know what to do with clothes. And I guess that we need like more work on that front. And I would like to start doing something on that lane. But I don't know. I'm just trying to understand. And obviously you guys have like way more understanding of the scenario. It just breaks my heart to hear like some of these other bits that I might not be aware of it.
Well, it's really hard to know, right? Also, because even when you try and do the right thing and donate to charities, you also have no way of really tracking where these donations end up. You tend to, I'm mostly just talking from my experiences, mostly in the UK, but I know that if we donate to Oxfam or to the Red Cross, a lot of the stock is not sold on to people shopping in the charity shops. It's then shipped to the global south, which is a whole issue in itself. I think this was also mentioned in the chat earlier as well. There are some NGOs in England. I work with one of them as well. It's a place called Give Your Best that is like an online marketplace that refugees and asylum seeking women and children can shop for free. And that's one way of like tracing. I don't know if there's something similar in the States, maybe. But yeah, I think, and unless you're able to upcycle or pass it on to people that there's no real responsible solutions. And we can have these take back programs, but there's also the jury's out on whether brands are actually implementing them as they say that they do. Also, because we have no transparency, right? There's nothing holding them accountable.
Also,
Thank
may
you.
I speak to that real quick?
Mhm.
So, hello everybody. I'm Justania McCauley. About 3 years ago, I went from saying professionally that I'm a stylist to stating that I'm a wardrobe utilization specialist because of that same issue. We need to have a better enclothed cognition. That's how we think about wardrobe. That's what we believe wardrobe is, right? So if we do not change our mental processes, we're going to still keep producing people that are susceptible to whatever the fashion industry is dictating is popular or trendy. So I just wanted to speak to that. If we start to question why we buy what we buy, why are we wearing what we're wearing, why do we store things the way we store things, why are we adding this stress to our lives, right? We'll start to, I noticed in my workshops and working with others and doing the things that I do in the field, that people are really like, oh, clothing is something that we're like, we wear it every day, we see it all the time, right? So it becomes like an underlying, it's just there, it's not going to change. But I think changing how we look at fashion, speak about it, and look at it like a tool for expression and a ways to connect with others deeper. That would be my answer to that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, like changing the whole narrative around how we dress, how we show ourselves through we dress. Like it looking at clothing as art instead of like this disposability aspect of it. I think that really starts from within in questioning how we view this whole system and what part like we play in it. And I love that you bring up enclothed cognition too, because that it could just geek out over fashion psychology all day, but that's for another time.
Georgia Lee, I see you have your hand raised if you would like to come off mute.
Hi, yes. I have a question. I would turn my camera on, but I just came back from a hike, so I'll just let you imagine what I look like. I came from the Midwest where we have a lot of agriculture and a lot of farming. And with that in America comes a lot of subsidies. And so how do I try to articulate, especially because in the Midwest, South Dakota specifically, there's not a lot of advocates and not a lot of people talking. And I feel like I have a very good audience or I came from a small area, but we all know each other, so I feel like I could have a good local impact. But I don't know how to say you guys are privileged to have these subsidies when other countries don't, and so that's why. I don't know how to shame or bring the emotional side of the conversation to really pull them. So if I could have any insight or ideas on how to just approach that conversation with people with very similar lives to the people in the supply chain, but yet such different lives. If you can help me or speak to that a little bit.
Yeah. I too am in the Midwest. I'm in Omaha, Nebraska, if you're familiar with the states. And it's been, I'm like, this is just all depressing. It's not. Centering find the common connection and honestly lead with love and from your heart space when talking to people, because we don't want to shame someone into change, right? That's never going to actually make lasting change. Like we'll shame brands and stuff all day long. Absolutely. Yes, we need to push for legislation. We need to push for change. We need to hold people accountable, particularly the people who are in charge of writing legislation. But when it comes to connecting with your community and individuals, you really connect from your heart and be like, we are not so different, line up the two with the agriculture and garment workers and just kind of look for those similarities. And really, especially knowing people in the Midwest, right? It's kind of that neighborly attitude, know your neighbor, connect it to that, connect it back to the things that you know are important to those people and show them that it is reflected in these garment workers and the people that makes our clothes. That's the best. That way you're coming from a place of we're all same kind of thing. And it's the one thing that I've found that really resonates with people. If you can make everybody just human and just level, because no one wants to hear that they have privilege, even though people do. They get all, their feathers get all ruffled, particularly in the Midwest. They're like, oh, no, we don't. Yes, you do. But no one wants to hear that. So if you can come from a place of like, this is this, and this is how it translates to this, and they can kind of, you can kind of lead them in the way that you kind of want them to think, but they got to get there on their own. And it will take it might take a very long time, but that's where the hope comes in, right? Like it's pushing the boulder up the hill, but it's worth it.
I love that. Yes. Thank you so much, Lauren.
Hopefully that's helpful.
Does anybody else have any questions? Lauren, I have one for you. I know something that you talked about in your article was luxury fashion supply chains. Could you just touch on that for a second? Because I know sometimes, like, especially looking from the outside in, luxury seems like it's something completely different than like fast fashion that we see at like H&M or Shein.
Yeah, without to get like too long-winded, back not even that long ago, couture houses were couture houses, and your Chanel and Louis Vuitton and Dior and Balenciaga, everything was made in a fashion house. And not that the garment workers at that time were treated super well, but they were treated better. And they, along with this globalization of everything, came, the globalization of the fashion industry. And it became cheaper to move everything overseas, right? We've seen that with fast fashion. Well, luxury fashion was like, why not us? And Heather had mentioned this earlier in the beginning. When you put that tag on your product, you only a fraction of that product has to be made in that country where that tag comes from. So even if it's the finishing, even if you're putting hardware on a handbag, you can put made in Italy on that. Like, for example, Louis Vuitton has a manufacturing plant. I think they only do handbags. I could be wrong, but it's in Texas. It's here in the States. So, but they ship everything back to France so they can have that label. And as we all know, or maybe we don't, there are very much modern day kind of indentured servitude in garment workers. In California, I mean, they passed the Garment Worker Protection Act, which is amazing. That kind of eliminates that piece rate. But as far as, the rest of the country, they don't have that. And independent workers and kind of watchdog groups have gone into these other factories and have found that it's just as bad for garment workers here as it is in the global South. And we often think that it's not. And recently, I think you can find the article on BOF and probably Diet Prada. There has been a probe into, I think it was in Prato in Italy, because there have been a lot of fast fashion brands coming into Italy and taking over their traditional production sector and then slapping on, a made in label. And then, you see a made in Italy label and that carries a lot of weight. You think that's great. Well, Dior is the most recent luxury brand to kind of succumb to those probes of like, oh, by the way, you're not treating your workers well either. I think maybe some of them were being paid less than 60 American dollars to make a bag that retails for over 2,000. So like, just because it is luxury doesn't mean that it's made ethically. And that's also another question, like who gets to own the term luxury, That's a long-winded answer to that. Sorry, Allison.
No, thank you, Lauren. Oh, Sonia, if you'd like to come up.
Hello, I think my question got lost in the chat, but I was curious. I know we're talking about this in a few weeks, but I'm curious what you two think about fiber shed playing into the solution I mean, not as opposed to legislation, but in addition to legislation, like how much of a factor would fiber shed communities in each of the states, for instance, play into a solution?
Yeah, I can start answering that. I'm very active in my fiber shed that we have here, which is the Rust Belt fiber shed that's coming on the program. And this is really the only fiber shed I've been a part of, so I can't, speak for all communities in general, but just from being active as a community member and doing a lot of projects that they have going on, I think it is huge in changing the mindset of communities, where they're located and supporting local. So it's not just about, you know, talking about soil to soil agriculture, soil to soil fashion, or regenerative agriculture, seeing how they work with farms from, alpaca farms or sheep farms, all the way to working with, family owned dye factories and spinners, to selling in brands in the community. I think there's a mindset shift that the fiber sheds, at least mine in Ohio, has really played, not just with myself and my community and my friends who I've kind of brought in to like drink the fiber shed Kool-Aid a little bit, but to see as like a community as a whole. I think it's huge and not as impactful as, direct policy. That does take a long time, but the same thing with like a lot of the in-person events that our remakers do. I think creating a community is a very short-term mindset shift that leads to long-term change. And then Lauren and Heather, if you had anything to add. Amazing. And then actually, I also wanted to ask Julie. I see Julie is on the call today. If you don't mind me putting you on the spot, Julie, I wanted to ask you, being in the industry for so long and then working with Remake, what gives you hope?
Really everything you guys said on the call today. First of all, like amazing, Heather and Lauren, like how you covered like how it all works in such a short amount of time. I was amazing. And I got so much out of it myself for how to speak to it because it is so complex. I think this whole local, like I think if we really, what Allison just, how you ended it, Allison, is so beautiful. It's like giving credit to thinking local and building community, because that is really where anything starts. And then that's where the groundswell will come and we can like make impact, whether it's like, at your local university or through like programming, like everything that you can share from, I mean, honestly, this call will be a great starting place to share with others. So totally gives me hope.
Thank you, Julie. And sorry again, just put you on the spot. I know you're at the WeWork. Does anybody else have any questions today? Thank you, Melissa, for your comment. If there's, and two, if there's anything, I know this was like a very broad overview of the fashion supply chains. But if anybody has anything specific that they're interested in learning in or want to see a program about, we do programs like this, 2 to 3 of them every single month virtually. That's open to the public. So if there are things that you are interested in learning more about or would love to see a program, I'll drop my email in the chat. A lot of what we do is community building and education connection and Remake to help build people, like all of you, to build their change making power. So we can all work together to make a difference in the industry. Also, this recording, like I mentioned at the beginning of the call, is going to go in our Ambassador resource drive after it downloads after the call today. If you're not a Remake Ambassador and you still want to see the recording, you could email me and I'll send it your way. And feel free to, send it to people that you think that may be interested in, watch it again, take notes, anything like that. And then lastly, I just wanted to drop Remake's website in the chat one more time. This is linked to our campaigns page, but you can see our whole website from here. And you can click around, see what we're working on, different action kits, ways that you can get involved. And yeah, thank you guys all for being here today. Lauren and Heather, I'm so appreciative of you both for working with me on this program, for writing the amazing articles that you did for Remake, which I could drop in the chat again for anybody who wants to read them. But yes, this has been an amazing program. I appreciate you all so much.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank
Thank you.
Tina.
Bye, everybody.